The wind moved slow across the empty prairie that evening, carrying the dry smell of sagebrush and iron rails, and the setting sun painted the sky the color of old copper, a color every cowboy knew meant the day was dying slow and quiet, the kind of quiet that made a man listen to his own thoughts a little too closely. And that was exactly what Cole Mercer had been trying to avoid for 3 long years, ever since the war left more ghosts in his mind than he cared to count. So he rode along the railroad tracks with no real destination, his horse stepping carefully between stones and weeds, until something unusual caught his eye ahead, a small shape sitting too still beside the rails, and in the fading light it looked like trouble waiting to happen. Cole pulled his horse to a stop, resting one gloved hand on the saddle horn as he studied the figure from a distance, because the West had taught him one important rule: nothing out here was ever exactly what it seemed. Not a shadow, not a stranger, not even a quiet town with its saloon lights glowing warm in the night. But this time it was not an outlaw or a drunk traveler, it was a girl, sitting alone on a wooden railroad tie with her knees pulled to her chest, staring down the endless stretch of steel track as if the whole world had run away from her and left her behind. She could not have been more than 17, maybe younger, with a worn brown coat hanging loose around her thin shoulders, and dusty boots that had clearly walked farther than any girl her age ever should, her dark hair tangled by wind and travel. And when Cole shifted in the saddle, the faint creak of leather made her turn slightly, just enough for him to see her face in the dim light, pale, tired, and carrying the kind of sadness that did not belong on someone so young, the kind that made a man wonder what storm had pushed her all the way out here to the lonely rails. Cole slid down from his horse slowly so he would not startle her, the gravel crunching under his boots as he stepped closer, though he kept a careful distance because the girl looked like a frightened colt ready to bolt at any sudden move, and he cleared his throat gently before speaking, his voice rough from too many dusty trails and too many quiet nights. "You know trains come through here, right?" he said, not accusing, not angry, just stating the obvious truth, hanging in the evening air. But the girl did not answer. She only kept looking down the track, as if she was waiting for something that might never arrive. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the wind brushing across the prairie grass, while the rails hummed faintly from somewhere far away, and Cole leaned lightly against a weathered fence post nearby, giving the girl space because he knew better than to crowd a wounded soul. And finally she spoke, her voice quiet and tired, like someone who had used up too many words already. "I know the trains come," she said softly. "That's kind of the point." And something in the way she said it made Cole's stomach tighten with a feeling he recognized all too well. He had heard that tone before, back in towns where hope had run dry, in soldiers who had come home with nothing waiting for them, in men who stared at whiskey bottles like they were doorways out of pain. And suddenly Cole understood exactly why the girl had chosen this lonely stretch of railroad, where no one would see her sitting there when the next locomotive came roaring through the dark. And that understanding planted his boots firmly in the dirt, because there were some things a man simply could not ride away from. Cole removed his hat and ran a hand through his dusty hair before stepping a little closer, still careful, still slow, like he was approaching a wild animal that needed patience more than force. And he lowered himself onto the gravel a few feet away from her, resting his elbows on his knees while staring down the track, pretending for a moment that he had come here for the same reason she had. "Name's Cole," he said quietly after a while, "and I got nowhere particular to be tonight." He paused before adding, "So I reckon I can sit here as long as you can." The girl finally turned her head, fully toward him then, confusion flickering in her tired eyes, as if she could not understand why a stranger would bother sitting in the dust beside her, instead of riding on toward the nearest town. And the silence between them stretched long again until she whispered, "Why would you do that?" And Cole gave a small shrug while watching the dark line of the horizon, his voice steady but gentle when he answered. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, "a person just needs someone stubborn enough to stay." And somewhere far down the tracks, a train whistle echoed faintly through the evening, rolling across the prairie like a warning carried on the wind. The whistle drifted through the prairie again, louder this time, rolling across the land like thunder that had learned to travel on steel, and the rails beneath their boots began to hum softly with the promise of something powerful coming closer. But neither Cole nor the girl moved. They simply sat there beside the endless line of track as the sky darkened into deep blue and the first stars began to appear. and Cole could feel the tension in the air, the same way a ranch horse feels a coming storm, because the girl had grown still again, to still, her eyes fixed on the glowing point of light, far down the rails where the train would soon appear. Cole tilted his head slightly and listened to the growing rhythm of the locomotive somewhere miles away, the iron heartbeat of it echoing through the ground, and he spoke without looking at her, keeping his voice easy like a man talking beside a campfire. "You got a name, kid?" he asked, and the girl hesitated for a long moment, as if deciding whether names still mattered anymore. Then she finally answered in a voice so quiet it nearly vanished in the wind. "Lena," she said, her fingers tightening around the edge of the railroad tie beneath her. "Lena," Cole repeated slowly, nodding to himself as though it was the most natural conversation in the world, though his eyes never left the growing light of the train far away. "That's a good name," he added, and she let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh once. "Long ago, before the world had grown heavy on her shoulders. Doesn't feel like it," she murmured, her voice carrying the tired weight of someone who had already decided how their story was supposed to end. The rails vibrated harder now, humming like a living thing, and Cole could see the locomotive clearly in the distance, its bright eye cutting through the darkness as it raced across the plains, and he knew they did not have all night anymore. But he also knew pushing too hard would only drive her deeper into whatever shadow had brought her here. So instead, he leaned back on his hands and stared up at the stars, speaking calmly as if they had been friends for years. "Funny thing about railroads," he said slowly. "They look like they run straight forever, but they don't. They curve eventually. Every single one of them." Lena did not answer right away, but Cole noticed her eyes drift from the approaching train to him, curiosity quietly pushing against the sadness she carried, and after a moment she asked softly, "What does that even mean?" And Cole shrugged again, the way cowboys do when they are not sure how to explain the world properly. "Means nothing stays the same direction forever," he replied, his voice steady over the growing roar of steel wheels. "Not roads, not railways, not lives either." The train whistle sounded again, closer now, and the wind rushed ahead of the locomotive like a warning, stirring Lena's hair around her face. But instead of leaning toward the tracks, she remained seated exactly where she was, her attention caught by the strange calm of the cowboy beside her, and she asked the question that had clearly been sitting on her tongue for a while. "Why are you really here?" she said. "You don't even know me," and Cole gave a small sigh through his nose before answering. "Truth is," he said slowly, his voice rough but honest, "a few years back I was sitting somewhere a lot like this," he admitted, though he still did not look directly at her, not by train tracks, but close enough to the same idea, and that made Lena turn fully toward him now, surprise cutting through her sadness, because cowboys looked like the kind of men who always knew exactly where they were headed. But Cole continued quietly, "I had lost near everything I cared about, thought the world had finished with me." He paused as the rails trembled harder beneath them. The train burst into view then, its massive engine roaring down the track with blinding light and thunderous force, the ground shaking beneath their feet as wind whipped around them. But Cole did not move. He stayed seated right there beside Lena, calm and solid like an old oak tree in a storm. And when the locomotive screamed past them, only a few yards away, he turned his head slightly toward her and spoke clearly over the deafening roar. "Difference is," he said, his voice firm and steady, "someone sat down beside me that night too." And Lena realized suddenly that without noticing it, she had leaned away from the tracks instead of toward them. The train thundered past them like a storm made of iron and fire, its roaring wheels shaking the ground and its wind whipping dust and grass across the prairie. But when the last rail car finally disappeared into the darkness and the sound faded into the distant hills, the night grew quiet again, the kind of deep quiet that made every small sound feel important. And Lena realized something slowly, something she had not expected when she first sat down beside those tracks. She was still there, still breathing, and the train that had seemed like the end of everything was now only a fading echo in the distance. Cole brushed some dust from his coat and rested his forearms on his knees again, looking down the empty track like it was just another ordinary evening on the frontier, though inside he felt the quiet relief of a man who had watched a storm pass without destroying what stood in its path. And after a long moment he spoke gently. "Well," he said with a faint crooked smile, "looks like the railroad missed its chance tonight." And Lena blinked slowly, the words settling in her mind as if they had cracked open a window she did not know was locked. For the first time since he had seen her, Lena's shoulders loosened a little, the tight knot of despair that had been holding her rigid beginning to unravel, and she stared down at her dusty boots while speaking quietly. "I thought it would be easier," she admitted, her voice trembling just enough to reveal the truth behind it. "I thought if I just sat here long enough, I wouldn't have to feel anything anymore." And the confession hung between them in the cool night air like a fragile piece of glass. Cole nodded slowly, understanding more than he wanted to, because the West had shown him plenty of lonely souls who believed silence was the only cure for pain, and he tipped his hat back slightly while answering her. "Pain's a stubborn thing," he said calmly. "Tries real hard to convince folks there's no road left worth riding." He paused before adding quietly, "But most times that's just the darkness talking, not the truth." Lena rubbed her sleeve across her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the tears that had slipped free without permission, and she let out a shaky breath that carried years of weight with it. "I don't even know where I'm supposed to go," she admitted, her voice barely louder than the wind in the grass. And Cole looked out across the open prairie for a moment before answering in the slow, thoughtful way of a man used to long journeys. "Truth is," he said, "most folks don't know that part either." He pushed himself to his feet then, stretching his back after sitting on the hard ground so long, and he offered a hand down toward her without rushing her decision, the simple gesture steady and patient beneath the starlight. "But I do know one thing," he continued, his voice calm as the quiet plains around them. "There's a little town about 5 miles west of here. Got a diner with terrible coffee and a cook who makes biscuits big enough to fix most bad mornings." He tilted his head slightly and added with a hint of humor, "And I was thinking I might head that direction." Lena stared at his hand for several seconds, as if it belonged to a different world entirely, a world where people did not disappear into the dark alone, and slowly, almost cautiously, she placed her trembling hand into his, letting him help her stand beside the quiet railroad tracks. And the moment her boots touched steady ground again, something shifted deep inside her chest, a tiny spark where emptiness had been sitting for too long. Cole walked over to his patient horse and loosened the reins before glancing back toward Lena, who now stood beside the rails no longer as someone waiting for the end, but as someone unsure yet curious about what came next. And as the cool wind rolled across the prairie, she surprised herself by letting out a small, hesitant smile, the kind that barely showed but still meant everything. And Cole tipped his hat politely before saying, "See there," his voice warm with quiet satisfaction. "Knew if I stayed long enough we'd find our way back to